Hi, I'm Whole History Nerd, and welcome to the first episode of Old Yorkshire, an occasional series in which I'll be visiting historical sites and monuments and giving you a little bit of the lowdown of the history of the place. And today we're at Skipsea Castle, and it's very, very wet. So, that's Skipsea Castle. I know what you're thinking. Whole History Nerd, you've gone mad. That's a hill. I know what a castle looks like. It's got walls and little bibbly bits at the top for people to shoot arrows through. And you're not wrong. But the castle has long since gone here, but what remains is interesting. You see, this was a style of castle called a motte and bailey castle, and it was brought over by the Normans after the conquest in 1066. And it consists of a motte, a mound, an artificial hill that was built in the middle of some flat land, and upon the top of which was built a wooden tower, which was often, in later cases, upgraded to stone as and when needed. And then surround it with a huge ditch and a series of hills topped with fences to protect the entranceway to the castle. And behind me you can actually see the earthworks of that bailey. And over there, that gap in the earthworks, well, that was one of the gates. Now, these kind of castles are dotted all over England, and they were necessary for the Normans because just because you've won a war by killing the king and deposing a load of hereditary nobles, replacing them with your own lackeys, doesn't mean you've won the country. The Normans were effectively a small occupying force in a country full of hostile English people, the Anglo-Saxons, and they put up a hell of a fight. History has forgotten a lot of the individuals, but some of them still make it through to the modern day. Characters like Hereward the Wake, for instance, in Cambridgeshire. And it's almost certain that some of the stories that are ascribed to Robin Hood may well have been passed down longer from those early days of English resistance. But the Normans were brutal in crushing this guerrilla warfare spirit, and it culminated in an epic and awful thing called the Harrying of the North, where the Normans effectively depopulated the north of England. Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Lancashire, all were just razed to the ground. Whole villages emptied and murdered and burned down. And after the harrying of the north had been done in the 1080s, he started encouraging his lieutenants to settle down across the country and make administrative centres. He parcelled out land to people who'd been faithful and friendly to him. One of those was a Flemish mercenary called Drogo, and he was given the area of Holderness, and he built his home here at Skipsea. Now, as Lord of the Manor, Drogo didn't actually last that long. He was given hand in marriage to William the Conqueror's niece, presumably in hopes of enhancing his ties to the royal throne and probably getting more land. But she was mysteriously poisoned. And before he actually told William that she'd been mysteriously poisoned, he said, "Oh, I'm just going to pop back to Normandy. I left the medieval gas on or something." And William just went, "Oh, okay, fair enough." Then he found out that his niece had been murdered and that this man was running off vaguely towards France. It's at this point that Drogo disappears from history. We can only speculate as to what may have happened to him, and I'm presuming he either lived a long and happy life somewhere in seclusion wearing a false beard, or he ended up dead in a ditch somewhere. So after the mysterious disappearance of Drogo from history, the castle was passed on to the Count of Champagne, a chap called Odo, and his family, his descendants, the Counts of Aumale, were to rule Skipsea for the next 130 years or so. One of his descendants, in the mid-1100s, actually built the town of Skipsea Brough, which is there. It's not so much a town as a kind of tiny hamlet. And to be fair, even in the Middle Ages, it really never got popular. But it was built because there was a growing fear amongst the Normans that the Danish would try and take advantage of Britain's relatively weak state at this point and stage an invasion. And they felt that having some town outside the gate of the castle would certainly provide a little extra protection. Skipsea used to actually have its own harbour. It's not a particularly big one, it was a kind of an inland harbour, like a haven, that was linked to the North Sea by a small navigable channel. At some point part of that was dammed off, and the whole area around there, which you can still see is very much still marshland, was flooded in order to provide extra defence for the castle. It formed what's called Skipsea Mere, which no longer exists. But perhaps one of the weirdest things about Skipsea is its location. Historians have long been confused as to why the Normans, who were traditionally really good at strategically placing their castles and their centres of administration across the country, why they would build a castle here. Because let's be brutally honest, Skipsea is about as far from the madding crowd as you can possibly get. It's situated not near any kind of easy emergency reinforcements, for example, from another friendly local lord. It's right on the east coast, with the entirety of the marshy land of Holderness between it and Help. It's far from the centre of Holderness too. It could have been built somewhere like Burstwick, which it later was. There was a castle built there, and the centre of administration was moved there in the 1200s. But Skipsea Castle was not to last. It was demolished in 1221 during the reign of Henry III. Henry had a reign that was punctuated by periods of barons trying to usurp him and take power for themselves. He was seen as quite a weak king. He was more interested in building Westminster Abbey than anything else. But the Count here, William de Force II, joined in one of the rebellions that failed. And yeah, it didn't turn out well for William. He lost his lands, and the castle here was demolished in 1221. In 2008, a group of archaeologists from Reading University identified that Silbury Hill in Wiltshire was a little bit too big to be a Norman motte, or at least it was a strange design, wider than normal and not quite as compact or conical. They did some investigations and took some core samples at Silbury and found out that actually Silbury Hill predated the Norman invasion by centuries. It was actually an Iron Age hill fort, or an old barrow or something of that kind of ilk. And then a few years later, one of the researchers realised that this looked a lot like Silbury Hill. In 2016, those researchers came to Skipsea with their equipment and took a sample from the core, burrowing deep down into Skipsea's hill, right to the bottom. And those cores that had not been exposed to the air for hundreds of years told an interesting story. One that explains perhaps why Drogo chose this spot to build his castle. You see, Skipsea Castle was already 1,500 years old when the Normans arrived. That hill has been here a long time. Think about what I said earlier on about the state of England after the Norman invasion. Guerrilla attacks, sneak attacks, sabotaging the castle building of the Normans. But if you're building a castle, the last thing you want is to keep getting interrupted before it's actually defensible. But if you had, say, an artificial defensible hill that was already in place, Well, I mean, really, you just need some wood to make a timber castle on top of it. That cuts down on your effort and your cost and the time that it takes to build your fortification. It's easy to see now, with that knowledge, why Drogo may have built the castle here at Skipsea. It was quick and it was easy and it was low risk. But unfortunately, it was still in a bad place. Berstwick took over sometime in the 1200s as the administrative centre of Holderness, and Skipsea faded from view. It was a held out to pasture with animals grazing on it as early as the 13th century. The mere was drained and it fell into obscurity.